So today's video is going to be another solved true crime case, and before I get into this, I just want to say a huge thank you for the amazing response to my first merch drop. Thank you so much to everyone that bought something in the first drop. It's still all available now if you do want something. And we recently added one more thing. I now have face masks. It's just a cute little black mask with the little logo. Yeah. So if you do want to pick one of those up, again, the link will be in the description. But thank you so much to anyone that's bought anything. Just, it means a lot to me because you are supporting my channel and my videos, because these videos are getting harder and harder to monetize these days. But yeah, enough of that. Before we get into this case, I just want to thank Skillshare for sponsoring this video. Skillshare is an online learning community with classes in a range of different topics, from creativity to entrepreneurship, lifestyle, photography, and more. You guys know that when I've spoken about Skillshare before, I especially love their productivity classes, but I've pretty much watched every single one of those at this point, so I've moved on. One I've recently found really useful was Interior Design Basics, Simple Steps to Perfect Your Space by Lauren Cox. During quarantine, I've started planning how I'm gonna redesign my bedroom, and this class has taught me so much about colour schemes and how to find my own personal style. But like I said, there's classes in so many different things, like how to start a YouTube channel, photography and Photoshop, cooking, music production, how to start a business, and so many more. I know a lot of us are just stuck in the house at the moment, so it might be nice to learn a new skill or improve a skill that we already have, or try and turn a hobby into a business with one of the classes. And Skillshare are very kindly giving 2 months free premium membership to the first 1,000 people that click the link down in the description to help you explore your creativity. And after that, it's only around $10 a month. Thanks again to Skillshare for sponsoring this video, but before we get into this case, I just want to give my usual disclaimer that I mean absolutely no disrespect to anyone that I talk about in this video. This video is for educational purposes, and everything I'm about to say is just information that I have found on the internet and I'm compiling into one video. So today's case takes place in a cosy little town on the edge of the Peak District in a town called Cromford in Derbyshire, England. It's the kind of town where everyone knows everyone. It's a very friendly place. It's a very proud place. People are proud to live there. It's very beautiful. Everyone cares for their space. It's just a nice place to be. For a small town, it's pretty popular with tourism. A lot of people travel there to go walking down all the scenic routes, have a look at all the picturesque landscapes. They've got a few high streets with the little shops on. But then on September 17th, 2009, this peaceful town was disturbed when a couple of tourists stumbled across a horrific scene on the roadside. A man named Peter Noble was out for a walk with, I believe, his wife around 12:40 p.m. when they were just walking down this kind of country lane, taking in all the sights. And they walked down this particular road that leads to Cromford train station. And as they got onto that road, they noticed a taxi parked rather oddly in the middle of the road. And because this taxi was rather out of place, Peter approached it and had a look to see if everything was okay. And when he got there, he realised that the boot of the car, the trunk of the car, was open. So he went over and lifted the door a little more to open it fully, and inside the boot of this car, he found a dead body, a man's dead body, covered in blood. So immediately Peter calls 999 and he tells them what he's just found, and he's emphasising the amount of blood. There is a lot of blood here. He thinks that this body in the boot is definitely deceased at this point. There's no way that this man in the boot could possibly still be alive when they've already lost this much blood. So Peter's on the phone to the responder, asking them to bring out both police and an ambulance, although he's feeling this guy's arm and he can't feel a pulse anywhere. The responder asked Peter where he thought the blood could be coming from this person, and he said, I don't know, there's a lot of blood here, although there was specifically a lot on his head. It seemed as though his head had maybe been battered, or I don't know, his head was seriously injured. That's all that Peter could tell just from looking at the body without touching it. So Peter was asked by the responder to stop touching the body for finding a pulse or whatever. Of course he meant well, but this is quite a clear crime scene. So the responder asked him and everyone that he was with to kind of step away from the car until police and an ambulance arrived. It didn't take long for them to arrive. However, as soon as paramedics got there and had a look at this body, there was absolutely nothing they could do. This man had already been dead for a short while, and so he was pronounced dead at the scene. On a brief examination of the body while it was still in the boot of this car, it seemed as though this man's cause of death had been gunshot wounds to the head. And this was later confirmed in his autopsy. He'd actually been shot twice with a rifle. I believe the first bullet that was fired only caused a superficial wound to this man's head. If it had just been that one shot, he would have survived. However, once the second bullet was fired, that one killed him instantly. A quick search of the crime scene showed up very little blood inside the actual taxi car itself. So it seemed as though this man had been killed elsewhere, maybe outside of the taxi and then his body was put in the boot, or maybe he was killed once he was already in the boot. However, there were little smudge marks of blood on the taxi in places, although they didn't have fingerprints in them, which was interesting. And because of this, this already led police to believe that maybe the killer was wearing gloves to hide their fingerprints. Maybe this was a planned murder. The back window of the taxi was smashed, which makes you think immediately that this was a more chaotic murder. Maybe there was a struggle, something happened that meant that that window got smashed. It's been later theorised that maybe it was that first bullet that smashed the back window, because for it to have hit this man's head and only caused a superficial injury, that meant that a lot of the power had to have been taken out of it. So maybe it went through something else first, and that took a lot of the power, and then when it hit him, it didn't cause as much damage as a normal bullet would. The taxi itself, like I said, it was very oddly parked in the middle of the road. It seemed as though maybe it had been ditched or something like that. And Cromford train station was on a very kind of quiet country road, and so if you were going to ditch a car anywhere, it would likely be on a road like this, because not a lot of people go up it, not a lot of people drive up it unless they're going to the train station. But other than that, there wasn't a lot more to tell from the crime scene. There was no immediate evidence, there was nothing really to go off at this point, and so crime scene investigators were brought in and the body was taken for an autopsy. In the meantime, police decided that they would try to track down where this taxi came from, what company it worked for, who drove it for that company. It was found that this taxi was registered to a company named MJ Taxis in that area, and this particular car was driven by a man named Stuart Ludlam. And it didn't take long until the body that was in for autopsy was identified as that of Stuart Ludlam. He'd been shot and left in the boot of his own taxi. Stuart Ludlam was a 43-year-old father and husband that had lived in Derbyshire his whole life. He'd been married to his wife Paula for almost 20 years and they had 3 children together, one aged 15, one aged 12 and one aged just 3 years old. And Stuart's wife and children were his pride and joy, his biggest achievement in life. He was so proud of them. They were all he would ever talk about, his co-workers said. Any spare time that Stuart had, he would spend with his children and with his wife. He was just a family man. Like I said, the taxi company Stuart Ludlam worked for was named MJ Taxis, and he'd been working there most of his adult life. He really got on with all of his co-workers, both his bosses. They were a couple named Mick and Tracy. He got on with them so well. And because he'd been working there so long, he'd built this trust with his employers that meant if Mick and Tracy ever needed the day off or they wanted to go on holiday, they would leave Stuart in charge of the whole company. Stuart was an avid football fan. He'd played football for most of his youth. I think he was in 2 different football teams. But in his adult life, he kind of stuck more to just watching the football. He supported Derby County Football Club and he would watch every single game. Stuart was known for his sense of humour and his jolly disposition. He was always wanting to help people. He was really kind and gentle, with his mother particularly describing him as larger than life. He was known for being a big softie. He never really had issues with anyone, and if he did have little disagreements, they were sorted really easily. He was a very likeable person, very easy to get along with. You never really held a grudge with Stuart Ludlam, and he would never really hold one with you. So police decided a good place to start in this investigation was to speak with Stuart's friends and family, just to get an idea of his life, who he hung around with, what kind of stuff he got up to see if there were any indicators in his normal day-to-day life of any conflict or someone that might want to do this to him. Because 80% of murders are carried out by someone that the victim knows. So more often than not, speaking with friends and family and finding out what kind of life the victim led can lead to identifying a suspect. But like I said, Stuart was just such a kind person that his family didn't think he had any kind of outstanding arguments or disputes or disagreements with anyone. He was just so easy to get along with. Like I said, he didn't have any enemies or any issues with anyone. So police's next point of action was to piece together the morning of Stuart's murder. What did he get up to that day? Who was he speaking to? You know, what was his plan for the day? Stuart woke up on Thursday the 17th of September 2009. He got showered and ready as usual and then got in his taxi and went to work. So he arrived at the taxi base in the morning, and on this particular day, his bosses, Mick and Tracy, actually had a funeral to attend. And like I said, if they ever needed to nip out or wanted a day off or something, they would leave Stuart in charge. So that is what Stuart was doing on this day. They'd be back at 1 p.m, so it really wasn't for too long. Stuart just had to drive his taxi as normal, but in between pickups and drop-offs, he had to answer the phone and take new customers. And because it wasn't peak hours, so I'm assuming peak hours are more like first thing in the morning and around like 5, 6 o'clock, because it was just the middle of the morning, there wasn't that much work to do. So Stuart spent the morning sitting in taxi walk-up ranks, you know, when they're all like parked along the side of the road and you just walk up and get in. He was seen in one of these kind of taxi ranks at 10:30 that morning. And then around 11:45 that morning, Stuart receives a call from a customer asking to pick him up at Cromford train station. And so he sets off to go pick this person up. At 1 p.m, Stuart's boss Tracy comes out of this funeral that she was attending and she turns on her phone. And when she does, she receives a lot of texts from their mechanic at the taxi place. And this man said that he hadn't heard from Stuart Ludlam in over an hour, which was an issue because he was supposed to be running the company that morning. He'd been calling Stuart's kind of work radio mobile type thing. I think it was done through like a radio system, and he wasn't answering. And so this mechanic even tried to call Stuart's private mobile number, and still he wasn't answering that. And it seemed as though both of these things, the radio and the mobile phone, were both switched off. Well, the mobile phone was switched off. The radio just had like a fail message every time you tried to call him. So Tracy herself tries to call Stuart Ludlam's mobile phone, and again, she gets no answer too. It goes straight to voicemail. And I know this is said in a lot of true crime cases, but this was very, very out of character for Stuart. He was a very hard worker. In his 15 plus years working at this taxi company, he had never done this before. He'd never turned off his phone. He normally answered it within the first 3 rings. So for him to have turned his phone off completely and not responded for over an hour, Tracy knew that something must have happened. Something was wrong. So Tracy and Mick got back to the taxi base and again tried to radio his taxi, and again, he wasn't picking up. It was just showing this like fail message. Tracy's immediate fear was that maybe Stuart had been in a serious crash and maybe his phone was broken. Maybe his car radio got broken in this smash. Of course, being a taxi driver, there's always that risk that you could get into a car crash. No matter how much of a good driver the taxi driver is, car crashes can be anyone's fault. Someone else on the road could be driving ridiculously and crash into them. And knowing this risk, knowing that any of her drivers could get into a crash at any point in any day, Tracy decided to report Stuart Ludlam as missing. And this meant that if he had been in a crash and maybe he was unconscious, or maybe he was unable to talk, maybe he was in such a bad way that he couldn't speak, then reporting him missing would be able to help police or the ambulance or paramedics to identify this man. And within 10 minutes of Tracy getting off the phone to police to report Stuart as missing, she receives a call from her mechanic, the first guy that rang her saying that he couldn't get a hold of Stuart. And this man said that there'd been a body found near Cromford train station. And what's worse, the body was found in a taxi. The news was already circulating the town, and although the body hadn't yet been identified, it could only be one person, and that was Stuart Ludlam. He was the only taxi driver that was missing. So Tracy and Mick, Stuart's bosses, went straight to Cromford train station, straight to the scene of the crime to see if they could help with anything. After all, they were probably some of the last people that Stuart spoke to. But by now, that whole area, pretty much, that whole street by the train station was cordoned off. It was all police taped up, and that doesn't happen with car crashes. Meanwhile, police had begun theorising what led to Stuart Ludlam being at the train station at that exact time that meant that he was killed. An immediate theory was that maybe Stuart had been lured to the train station that day. Someone had called the taxi company and asked for a taxi at Cromford train station, and when Stuart arrived, that was when his killer attacked him. And this theory splits off into two kind of sub-theories. The first one of these sub-theories, that's not a word, I just made that word up. The first sub-theory was that maybe this was a total stranger that just came to the train station, called any random taxi number, and just attacked randomly. They didn't know that Stuart was working, Stuart wasn't specifically targeted, they were just waiting to kill whoever turned up. Or maybe the second sub-theory is that maybe this was someone that knew that Michael was working at MJ Taxis that morning. They knew he was on shift, they knew he worked for that company, and they were trying to get Stuart alone and away, kind of on a back road, so that they could attack him. Both theories are equally believable because the train station did just have loads of taxi leaflets in it, so it could be a total stranger that just found the taxi number and called and just killed whoever turned up. But again, Stuart was quite a popular taxi driver in that area. Maybe it was someone trying to target him. And so police looked into that second sub-theory first, because that's the easiest one to find a suspect in, when you already know all the people that are close to him. So they questioned all his friends, all his family, all his co-workers. Everyone was treated as a person of interest, which is uncomfortable to, question someone's own wife or own boss as someone that might have murdered the victim, but it's got to be done. But police quickly ruled out pretty much everyone that was close to Stuart. They all had pretty solid alibis. Like I said, Mick and Tracy were at the funeral. His mother, Sheila, was actually at the supermarket at the time of the murder, which could be proven. In fact, his mother, Sheila, when she was shopping at the time of the murder, she actually heard the sirens of the police and the ambulance responding to her own son's murder. And she had no idea. In an interview that she did for a TV series, Sheila actually said that as she was leaving the supermarket, she turned to her mother-in-law and pointed out these sirens and said, "Oh God, that must be something serious." And her mother-in-law turned to her and told her not to worry because it's nothing to do with them. However, little did they know that those sirens were responding to her son's murder. So now, pretty much everyone that was close to Stuart was mostly ruled out. They didn't rule anyone out completely, but they were kind of low on the people of interest scale. So police decided that they were looking for an opportunistic murderer, someone that didn't know Stuart, they didn't target him specifically, but Stuart was just the unfortunate victim in this. And these are always the hardest cases to solve because where do you even start? Where do you start looking for suspects that aren't linked to the victim in any way? In cases like these, police heavily rely on the public, on potential witnesses coming forward, on, anyone giving any kind of lead. Stuart's mother and his wife went on the TV to do a public appeal and ask anyone that had any information to please come forward to police. CCTV cameras are normally a good start in cases like this. However, because this was a country road, there weren't any. There were security cameras on the train station, however, their reach didn't go as far as where the taxi was left. so they didn't actually catch anything on those cameras to do with the murder anyway. As police were looking for more leads, news of the murder began spreading around Derbyshire, and due to the lack of official police information, because they can only release a certain amount of stuff before the case has been solved, a lot of people began gossiping. There were a lot of rumours of a lot of different suspects and a lot of different motives as to why someone might want to murder Stuart Ludlam. One of the suspects in particular that a lot of people talked about and gossiped about in the area were Tracy and Mick, his bosses. A lot of people said that they thought Stuart and Tracy were having an affair, and maybe Mick found out and murdered Stuart in some kind of revenge. Other rumours included drugs and drug dealing. A lot of people thought Stuart was a drug dealer. Maybe he was in debt and someone was trying to get him to repay it. There were rumours of blackmail. Maybe he was being blackmailed. There were robbery rumours. There were rumours that Stuart had maybe wronged someone and someone was trying to get revenge on him. One rumour in particular involved a rival taxi company. And maybe there'd been such a feud between MJ Taxis and this other taxi company that maybe one of them had turned round and murdered Stuart Ludlam. Whatever the circumstances, the bottom line was that someone had been murdered in this seemingly very safe, cosy, quiet little town, and everyone was scared. People kind of wanted there to be this very secret, juicy storyline behind the murder because they didn't want to believe that this was just a random murder in their safe, nice little town. They didn't want to believe that there was a mad gunman on the loose that was still not caught for this murder. People were scared to walk places alone, or take the train alone, or take taxis alone. Taxi drivers themselves were, of course, scared to pick up customers because what if this person was particularly targeting taxi drivers? What if they were planning to do it again? A few taxi companies in that area actually brought in a rule that they would only pick up regulars, people that they'd already ridden with, already, taken places before, and they were safe, people whose numbers they already had in the database, people that they trusted. Quite early on in the investigation, as these rumours were going round about this feud with another taxi company, a witness came forward to police to tell them that they'd seen a yellow cab in the area of Cromford train station around the time of the murder. However, yellow cabs are very common in Derbyshire. They're kind of like black cabs in London. All the cabs in Derbyshire, not all, but like a lot of them are yellow. So this really didn't narrow it down too much, but it was useful to know. So police decided to look into this taxi rivalry rumour, and they brought Mick and Tracy, Stuart's bosses, in for another questioning. Although Mick and Tracy said that they had no beef, no kind of disagreements, no feud with any taxi company, and they didn't know that any of their drivers had any disagreements with any other drivers. There was no feud, there was no rivalry. And police knew that it'd be very hard to track down this particular yellow taxi cab because there were a lot of them around. So they kind of kept it in the back of their minds, but they continued with the investigation. They continued looking at other things and other leads. Stuart Ludlam's funeral took place not long after the murder, and a memorial parade was actually set up by his friends and family and other local taxi drivers in that area. Taxi drivers from all over Derbyshire, from so many different companies, all came together that day along with his friends and family to celebrate Stuart's life. They had this parade in the streets with all the cars and, cheering and everything, and they even did their own spin on a minute's silence, where instead of being silent for a minute, they all sounded their taxi horns for a minute and made as much noise and celebrated as much as they possibly could for Stuart. Meanwhile, the investigation was still going on, and for police, the next obvious kind of route to go down was checking Stuart's call history from the morning of his murder. Because if their theory is right that he was lured to the train station by a customer, then surely that would have been the last call on his phone records. So police looked through Stuart's phone records and they found that this call, the last call that he ever took, was made from a mobile phone, which is exactly what they were hoping for, instead of like a payphone or something that they couldn't track down to an individual. So police got in touch with this mobile phone's phone company and just asked for any information that they had about this particular phone and maybe its owner. And the network was actually able to track when and where this particular mobile phone had been purchased, and it had been purchased at a Morrison's supermarket, and it was a pay-as-you-go phone. Now, a pay-as-you-go phone is exactly what it says in the name. I don't know if they're called that everywhere, so I'm just going to explain it anyway. Instead of paying for these kind of phones monthly, you will pay for them as and when you want to use them. So you get these things called top-ups. You can walk into a shop and say, I want a £10 top-up for this network, and they'll give you like a little voucher, a little code that you input in the phone, and then you've got £10 worth of calls, text, internet to do whatever with. However, the downside of these pay-as-you-go phones is that they're very hard to trace because there's no direct debit coming out of a person's bank every month. They can just go and pay for a top-up in cash and put it on their phone themselves. There's no record, really. So that made this immediately clear to police that this was a burner phone. Whoever had bought this phone and used it to call for a taxi that day had done it because they can't be traced. And immediately this case seemed a lot more calculated than police originally thought it was. It seemed a lot more, I don't want to say sinister because a murder is always sinister, but now it seemed as though whoever had done this had put some serious thought and time and effort into this. The network couldn't exactly trace who bought the phone, but they could tell police that it had been topped up since it had been purchased. And so police decided to try and trace this top up just in case that had been paid for using a card rather than cash. The network told police that the top-up had been purchased at Morrison's petrol station, so just outside the Morrison's supermarket. So police went to this petrol station and they spoke with the people inside and they said, do you have any record of this purchase, of this top-up on this phone? And the workers looked for a while and they said, oh no, sorry, there's no record of that. So the police officer went back to the police station and relayed this information to the team and said they don't have any record of it. And his co-workers were like, what do you mean there's no record of it? There's got to be a record of it. These big chain supermarkets have to keep records of all their sales. Go back and ask again. So the police go back to the petrol station again and they ask again, and after a lot more searching, the workers come back and they found the record. The reason they didn't find the purchase on the records before was because whoever had paid for this top-up had actually paid for fuel at the same time, and because the fuel costed more than the top-up, so the petrol was £20 and they bought a £5 top-up. So because the petrol cost more, it had gone down in their records as fuel rather than phone top-up. Anyway, that was a little bit confusing. Basically, this person had paid for £20 petrol and £5 phone top-up using a credit card, which is exactly what police needed. So police got in contact with the bank and asked them to trace this credit card and find them a name, and they did within hours. They had their first suspect's name. The name on this bank account was Colin Cheatham, but that told police nothing. I mean, it was the best information they had so far. Police had no idea who Colin Cheatham was. He wasn't one of Stuart's friends or families or associates. They'd never heard this name before, especially not in this investigation. So now police had to figure out who Colin Cheatham was, and more importantly, why he'd bought a burner phone to call a cab that day. So police ran his name through their database and no previous criminal history came up at all. However, they did see on his records that he was approved for a gun license. And this means that Cheatham was one of the very small percentage of the UK that legally had access to firearms. And what was Stuart murdered with? Cheatham had been a member of his local gun club for 13 years. So he knew how to shoot, and this also meant that he had access to the exact type of gun that was used to kill Stuart Ludlam. So this was a man that was seeming very suspicious. He knew how to shoot, he had access to the gun. However, police needed to prove that he was actually the one that purchased that burner phone, because there's always the possibility that he had his credit card stolen and someone else purchased the burner phone with his credit card. After all, this killer had taken many precautions that meant that this burner phone wouldn't be traced back to them. For example, it was pay-as-you-go. He paid for the mobile phone in cash when he bought it. So it makes perfect sense that they would also steal a credit card to make top-ups on the phone. Maybe Colin Cheatham had had his card stolen by this killer and he had no idea. When police found his firearms license on their database, this also comes with a picture. And so they used this picture to cross-reference against CCTV footage from outside that Morrison's supermarket on the day that the phone was bought to see if this was Colin Cheatham going inside the store to buy the phone. And on this CCTV footage was Colin Cheatham. There he was. It was him using his credit card that day to buy the phone. The camera footage shows Colin Cheatham parking outside in a disabled spot and then walking into Morrison's, picking up an empty phone box off the shelf. Because that's how that works, by the way, or how it used to work. I don't know what it's like now. But if you were buying a phone in a supermarket, they're just like empty boxes out on the shelf. You've got to pick up the box, take it to the till, and then the person at the till will go into the back and get you the real phone out, just so that they can't be stolen. He pays for the phone in cash, and then as he's leaving Morrison's, he enters the disabled toilets. And it seems that he actually activated the phone while he was in there. So with pay-as-you-go phones, I believe you have to like call a number that rings the network and then it kind of activates the phone. And with the network's records, it places the activation at the exact time that Colin Cheatham would have been in that toilet. So this was enough for police to arrest Colin Cheatham. They couldn't charge him with anything just yet because they didn't have any solid evidence, but they just wanted to question him a bit more and just have him at the police station so that they could talk to him about all of these weird circumstances. 10 days after the murder took place, Colin Cheatham was brought into the police station and interviewed. And while that was going on, other officers were searching his home that he shared with his wife Jennifer. But before we get into that, I just want to give a little bit more information about who Colin Cheatham was, what his life was like, what he was like. He was a 61-year-old married man with 2 adult children. He was seemingly born and raised in Derbyshire and had remained there his whole life. He was retired at the time of this case after working for a textiles company. He'd been forced to take an early retirement due to his deteriorating physical health. He had bad arthritis that meant he walked with a stick, he had high blood pressure and also diabetes. On a search of his house, officers said that it was an absolute inhabitable mess. It was just filled with clutter that he'd hoarded over the years, along with some other not very nice things. There were empty food wrappers around, half-eaten food, some of it moulding, and there was also bottles of Cheatham's own urine. And not just 1 or 2, there was a lot. Now, I don't know for what reason he was going to the bathroom in a plastic bottle instead of a toilet, whether it was out of laziness, maybe it was his disabilities, maybe sometimes he just couldn't get to the toilet fast enough because, you know, his legs can't get there fast enough. Or maybe it was because the house was so messy and there was just so much stuff. There were magazines piled from floor to ceiling on every surface, like gun magazines, photography magazines. He just liked magazines, apparently. It was just such a mess, mainly upstairs, but also downstairs. Downstairs was also disgusting. The house was just such a state, especially the upstairs. The second floor was so bad that you just couldn't move. You couldn't live up there. The second floor was unlivable. So Cheatham and his wife actually slept and lived downstairs. The only time they would go upstairs is to, I don't know, get something from the heaps of clutter that's up there. As they were searching through all of this junk in Cheatham's house, they came across a camera. And as they were flicking through the photos on this camera, they found a lot of pictures that Cheatham had taken himself of local railway stations in Derbyshire. And of course, this is an immediate red flag because Stuart Ludlam was murdered at Cromford train station. He was lured to Cromford train station and there was pictures of that exact railway station on this camera. Perhaps Cheatham had been studying the railway stations in the area. Maybe he knew the plan that he wanted to carry out. He was just figuring out which train station was the most remote, the most quiet, the most quaint, one where he wouldn't be disturbed. But what was even more concerning was that on this same camera, Colin Cheatham had taken pictures of Cromford railway station's train timetable, so he could tell when every single train was coming in every day, so he knew the exact right time to plan it that he wouldn't be interrupted. But not only that, Cheatham had also taken a picture of all of the taxi leaflets on display in Cromford train station, so he knew exactly which taxi companies he could contact. Alongside these suspicious pictures were also a number of pictures of Colin Cheatham's everyday life, and of course a lot of that included his time at the gun club. There were a lot of pictures of him posing with guns, trying to look really intimidating, or looking really smug and just smiling with a gun in his hand, which is very eerie. So while police were searching his home, they decided to also go around and speak with a few of his neighbours and just get an idea of the kind of person he was like on the day-to-day, what he was like at home, you know, if anyone had any opinions of Cheatham. But none of them did, because none of them had ever really spoken to him. Apparently he was quite a recluse. In the 20 years that he'd lived there, he'd barely spoken to any of his neighbours and barely left the house. While they were at his house, they also searched his car, and they didn't find much in there apart from a box of latex gloves in the glove box. And if you recall, right at the beginning of the video when they were searching the crime scene, I said there were smudges of blood in the taxi, but no fingerprints. And now this all made sense to police. Maybe Colin Cheatham was wearing latex gloves, and that's why there's no fingerprints in the blood. Meanwhile, in his questioning at the police station, Colin Cheatham seemed a little bit nervous, but also a little bit cocky. It's kind of hard to explain. He was one of those people that when he's asked a question, he will just talk and talk and talk and go off topic and go on a tangent and then come back to it and then go off again on another tangent. And this meant that he was telling police a lot of information that he didn't need to tell and probably didn't want to tell. Perhaps this was to try and, you know, knock police off his track, maybe make them forget what they even asked him in the first place so he doesn't have to give an answer. Or maybe this was out of nerves. Maybe this was like word vomit and he just couldn't stop, and, you know, he felt like he looked a bit more confident if he just kept talking and he wasn't too quiet, but, you know, it kind of backfired. For example, one of the things that Cheatham said that kind of incriminated him a little bit was he was talking about these OCD tendencies that he claimed he had. And one of these tendencies was that he had a very particular way of paying for things in shops. If the item or items that he was paying for came to under £10, he would always pay in cash. If it came to over £10, he would always pay on card. Now, think back to the mobile phone, the burner phone, and the top-up. The phone actually came to about £9.95, so only just less than £10, and he paid for that in cash. However, the top-up came to £5 plus his £20 fuel, that's over £10, so he paid for that on his credit card. Cheatham probably thought that by dropping in that little piece of information that he was seeming less shady because he had an explanation as to why he bought this burner phone with cash. But what he really looked like he was doing was over-explaining himself, you know, like coming up with reasons as to why he had all this suspicious behaviour. It was like he thought through a reason for everything and had to tell police all those reasons, even without being asked. It just made him look more suspicious. If anyone else had these kind of OCD tendencies of particular ways of paying for things, they wouldn't bring that up, you know, unprovoked. So anyway, moving on from that, police confronted Cheatham about the pictures of the different railway stations that they found on his camera, and they said, well, why are we taking these pictures of all these different train stations? And Cheatham said that he was actually making a calendar for his friend that really liked railway stations. So he was taking all these pictures himself, and then he was going to make up this calendar himself and give it to the friend as a present. However, police found absolutely nothing in his possession that he could make a calendar with. He didn't have a laptop or a computer or, you know, a printer, nothing like that. Since police found out what kind of car Colin Cheatham drove, they checked the CCTV footage around the area of Cromford Station on the day of the murder. So not very tightly close to the train station, but kind of the surrounding areas, to see if Colin Cheatham was in that area of Cromford that day. And what do you know? They found his car on CCTV footage. I'll put it in right here. So police asked Cheatham if he'd been anywhere near the murder scene that day. Before, after, just had he been to Cromford railway station that day, because his car was relatively close. And Cheatham said yes. Obviously, because there were no CCTV cameras around Cromford railway station, they couldn't say for sure that he went right up to the train station. But he was in the general area, so he could have easily said no, but he incriminated himself by saying yes. But he went one step further than that, and Cheatham told police that he'd actually seen the crime scene before anyone else had seen the body. He said he saw the taxi in the middle of the road, he saw the boot open, he saw the man, he saw a dead body in the boot, he saw that he'd been shot in the head twice, which was odd, because the way that Stuart Ludlam's body was laid in the boot of that car, you couldn't see that he'd been shot in the head. That was something police learned when they took the body out and had a proper look. So how did Colin Cheatham know that Stuart had been shot in the head twice? That he was telling police information that only police knew. Only police and the killer would know. And as soon as Cheatham said that, police knew that they had the right guy, and they charged Colin Cheatham with the murder of Stuart Ludlam. Of course, this was an immediate relief for the people of Derbyshire. Not only was Stuart Ludlam receiving justice, but they were all safe. This was an opportunistic killer that seemed to have murdered Stuart for no reason, and they could have easily done it to more and more people had they not been caught. But when the news broke and the picture of Colin Cheatham was aired on the news, the people of Derbyshire realised that this had been one of their own. A local man. Cheatham lived in a place called Ripley, which is just a 20-minute drive from Cromford. And in the aftermath of the killing, Stuart's mother, Sheila, actually found out that she'd grown up on the same street as her son's murderer. Colin Cheatham's trial began on June 14th, 2010, and all the evidence was presented to the jury. The train station pictures, him buying the top up for the phone, the CCTV of his car by the scene on the day of the murder. The prosecution said that Colin Cheatham set out that day to murder someone, to take someone's life. Not Stuart's particularly, but he was just the unfortunate person that answered the phone that day. It could have been anyone. They believe that no matter who had picked up that phone call, no matter what taxi company it was, no matter who had arrived at the train station that day, Colin Cheatham would have killed anyone. They said that Cheatham had planned and studied how to carry out a crime of this level for a long while before he did it. This was incredibly premeditated. He'd studied all the different train stations in the area, figuring out which one was the best to commit a murder from, which timetable had the biggest gap in it so that he wouldn't be disturbed. Of course, no one knows exactly what happened in what order on the morning of the murder. Well, apart from Colin Cheatham, and he is denying all involvement in this murder. So instead, police have had to theorise, based on the physical evidence at the scene, what they think happened in what order that day. They believe that Colin Cheatham actually drove to Cromford railway station that morning. He didn't get the train in, he drove there and parked his car so that once he'd committed this murder, he could drive it back again. They believe he got there, he phoned MJ Taxis and ordered a taxi to Cromford railway station, and so Stuart picked up that call and went to the station. They think that when Stuart got there was no one there. Maybe Cheatham was waiting down the road, maybe hiding down the road for a second, and Stuart's waiting there for a minute or two. He realises no one's there, and so he turns the car around and begins driving back down the road. And that was when he was stopped by Colin Cheatham. Either Cheatham flagged him down, just normally how you would flag down a taxi, or maybe he was stood in the middle of the road with the gun in his hand, looking very intimidating. Either way, Stuart Ludlam stopped the taxi. Colin Cheatham comes round to the driver's side door and pulls the gun out and puts it to Stuart Ludlam's head and says, "Get out of the taxi." So Stuart does as he's being ordered. He gets out of the taxi then and there, which is why it was left in the middle of the road. And Colin Cheatham tells him to go round the back of the car, and when they get there, he tells him to open the door of the boot and climb inside. And so Stuart does as he was told. He gets in the boot of the car, tucks up his knees, and that is when Colin Cheatham shot him twice in the head. It's unknown how long this interaction took. I don't know if it was prolonged. I don't know if it was literally as quick as I just explained it. Of course, we don't know what Colin Cheatham was saying to Stuart, if Stuart was saying anything back, if he was pleading for his life or anything. Did Stuart know he was going to die? Or did he think this was going to be a robbery, or perhaps him being kidnapped as the car was being robbed, you know. So Colin Cheatham decided to plead not guilty to this murder, although he couldn't deny that his gun had been used to murder Stuart Ludlam. So he came up with this big story to say that he was unwillingly implicated in the murder. He hadn't pulled the trigger, he didn't even know that his gun was going to be used to kill someone. But it was his gun. He said that he'd met two men at the pub named Stan and Jeff who were looking to get revenge against a local drug dealer that had got one of their daughters into drugs, and now she was addicted, she was in a bad way, and you know, her father felt like he needed to take revenge against this drug dealer. So Cheatham claims that Jeff asked to borrow his gun. He said that he wasn't going to use it, he wasn't going to shoot it, he was just going to use it to intimidate this drug dealer. So Cheatham lent this man his gun, and then a few days later, he hears of this murder of this local drug dealer who was also a taxi driver. Basically, it seemed as though Colin Cheatham was really playing on the rumours that had gone round Derbyshire. All those rumours that Stuart Ludlam was involved in drugs, he was a drug dealer, you know, Cheatham had used those to his advantage because a lot of people already thought them, so this story seemed a bit more believable. So police did everything in their power to try to investigate this story, because if it wasn't Cheatham that actually shot the gun, then there's another killer out there somewhere. So they went into the pub that Cheatham claims he met these two men, Stan and Jeff, at. However, none of the workers in that pub know a Stan or Jeff. None of the regulars in that pub know a Stan or Jeff. It was hard because police only really had the names Stan and Jeff to go off. However, Cheatham did say that he thought that one of them was a plumber. He thought that one of them had said that in conversation. So police also asked around a lot of plumbers in that general area, a lot of other kind of workers in those sorts of careers, to see if they knew of a Stan or a Jeff that was, you know, looking to get revenge on a drug dealer. No one did. It was very clear that this story was just completely made up. He was just trying to put the blame on someone else, and, you know, he clearly hadn't thought it through well enough. But there was just way too much evidence to say that Colin Cheatham was just a cold-blooded killer. He was killing. Police believe his motive was that he just wanted to know what it felt like to kill someone. He'd had a pretty normal life, he'd done everything he wanted to do, he'd had the marriage, he'd had children, he had a career, and now he needed something new. And he was getting to the end of his life, and he was thinking, you know, I want to know what it feels like to kill someone. It actually emerged in his trial that this hadn't been Cheatham's first attempt at killing a taxi driver. He'd actually tried this shortly before the murder of Stuart Ludlam. This taxi driver came forward as soon as he saw Colin Cheatham's name and face in the news and said, "Oh, I'm a taxi driver and I have a really weird story about this man." The driver said that Cheatham had ordered this taxi to a very remote, isolated area, trying to get the driver alone, most likely. So the driver got them there, he dropped Cheatham off, but as he was getting out of the car, he was kind of frustratedly fumbling around in his pocket. Perhaps was he trying to get a gun out of his pocket? He never actually did anything to this taxi driver and they got away completely safe, but you know, maybe he was trying to get the gun out, but it was stuck at a weird angle and he just couldn't get it out, and so he decided to just give up and he'd try again another day. Either he was trying to kill the driver and something got in the way and so he decided to give up, like, you know, getting the gun stuck or whatever, or he never intended on killing the driver, but he was using this as kind of like a practice run, you know, to build his confidence a bit. Maybe he was figuring out, you know, where to get the taxi to or when to pull the gun out on the driver. So anyway, at the end of the trial, the jury went to deliberate, and when they came back, they found Colin Cheatham guilty of the murder of Stuart Ludlam. He was sentenced to life in prison due to the calculated, premeditated callousness of this crime. He was clearly in a sound mind as he was doing this, you know. There wasn't any mental issues there. He was just a cold-blooded killer and he showed absolutely no remorse. So life in prison is the safest option for society. Of course, it's justice for Stuart Ludlam, but a man like this should never be free, because the judge actually believed that had he not been caught in this murder, had he not paid for the phone top-up on a credit card, maybe police would have never found Colin Cheatham, and they think that he would have gone on to commit more murders after this if he would have gotten away with this one. But that's about all I've got on this case. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed. Thanks again to Skillshare for sponsoring this video. Remember, the first 1,000 people to click the link down below in the description will receive 2 free months of premium membership on Skillshare. And after that, it's only around $10 a month. But yeah, if you enjoyed this video, make sure you leave a big thumbs up down below. Remember, the face masks are out now. Subscribe down... I can't do this. I can't do that. Subscribe down below if you want to see some more from me. I upload videos like this all the freaking time, and my upload schedule is doing really well at the moment. Thank you so much to all of my channel members for their continued support with the channel, especially to Tier 2 that helped me choose the cases that I cover. But yeah, thank you so much for watching. If you want to subscribe, there's a link right here in this little circle. You can click that. If you want to subscribe to my second channel, there's a circle there for that as well. If you want to watch another one of my videos, there's a playlist on screen right now of all of my true crime videos. Bye!